Today we'll be replacing the front shocks, or struts, on a GMC Envoy. We will be answering the questions: what is the difference between a strut and a shock? Can super stiff HD shocks cause your car to go airborne? And can spring compressors kill someone when used improperly?
It's spring compressors.
For this repair, you'll need the following: 14, 15, 18, 22, and 26 millimeter impact sockets.
I say sockets?
Yeah.
Socket.
Ah!
I know.
14, 15, 18.
Hold on, no, you still say it normal.
18 millimeters and 22 millimeters box wrench, breaker bar, sledgehammer, impact wrench, 6 millimeter Allen key, spring compressors, and a flathead screwdriver. Loosen the 19 millimeter lug nuts and remove the tire. Place an 18 millimeter socket and 18 millimeter wrench on both sides of the pinch bolt of the yoke. You can spray the pinch bolt with PB Blaster and let it sit. In our case, we could not fit an impact wrench, and an air ratchet was too weak, so we used a breaker bar. You can also use a hammer to knock the bolt out from the bottom of the yoke. You'll need to place something behind the bolt to push it out in order to unscrew it.
Now for this last part, you're going to have to put something behind the bolt. So while you're unscrewing it, the weight, so I'm using the weight of the hammer behind it, and then I'm loosening it with this wrench, and it should...
Next, you will remove two 18 millimeter nuts at the top of the mount of the strut tower. Do not remove the center nut. A deep 18 millimeter impact socket with extension will work for the back bolt. You can remove the airbox to get in front of the 18 millimeter bolt, or you can try it our way and access it from the wheel well. You'll need an 18 millimeter wrench for the front bolt and use short throws to loosen it until you can unscrew it by hand. Next, you will need an impact wrench to loosen the 26 millimeter nut that locks the yoke into the lower controller arm. In order to remove the strut tower, you may have to move this anti-sway bar link out of the way. In order to do this, you will place a 16 millimeter Allen wrench in the center of the bolt and a 22 open-ended wrench around the nut. Use the direction of the rotating Allen key to push up against the controller arm. Continue to unscrew the nut with a 22mm wrench. Push the anti-sway bar link ends out of the way. Pull out the strut tower with both hands. With the strut tower assembly removed, take a sledgehammer and hit the bottom of shock upwards. Once the shock is somewhat outside of the yoke, hit the top of the yoke downward until it separates from the shock. Next, you will need 19mm impact socket to tighten the spring compressors. You will need an open-end wrench to remove the nut and a AA 6mm Allen wrench to go into the top of the bolt. Place both spring compressors on opposite side of the springs. Be extremely cautious. With both spring compressors on, push in all 4 safety pins so they are in between the opening of the coil. Make sure neither the top or the bottom of the strut is pointing at you. Place your 19mm impact socket wrench on one of the Place your 19mm impact socket wrench on one of the compressors. You must make an equal amount of turns on each compressor to make sure they are tightened evenly. In our case, we did 15 turns on each end before switching. In total, we alternated 15 turns twice on each compressor, with a total of 30 per each slide. You can tell that the springs are compressed as the ratchet will be harder to turn. This is the main reason you do not want to compress with an impact or air ratchet. Use the 15mm box wrench and the Allen key on the top of the strut bolt. Be careful of using your foot to hold down on the Allen wrench as you are putting your foot in the line of fire. A better method to use an Allen wrench extension ratchet and hold the 13mm wrench down with your foot, as this keeps your foot out of the line of fire. While our passenger strut disabled easily, the driver's side bolt was rusted. In this case, Moron Reviews recommends that you have a professional do this job, but we found that sawing the top off a bolt using an impact wrench on the nut to work. Do not try this at home.
This is very dangerous.
It's very dangerous, yes.
Actually, we shouldn't have even done it. But I had to get to work on Monday.
After you remove the nut, remove the top hat from the strut tower. Use a sledge and flathead to remove the top assembly. Do not hit the springs with a sledge in any way. Remove the boot from the top of the assembly. Pull the shock out from the spring coil from the bottom of the assembly. Here's a comparison of original shocks with 211,000 miles and 13 years compared to a new shock. Spring coils do not need replacing unless damaged. Insert the new shock to the bottom of the spring coil and reassembly. Align the lower spring seat with the springs. Align top assembly with springs and tighten the 13mm nut back onto the top shock mount bolt. Torque to 33 foot-pounds, as stated in the Haynes manual. Decompress the spring in the exact order you compress them. 15 turns twice on each side alternated. Once the shock has been tightened with the top assembly, take a sledge and hammer the yoke back onto the bottom. Be careful. The yoke has to go back at the exact same angle it was on the original shock. Otherwise, the top two bolts won't align with the chassis strut mount. Won't align with the chassis strut mount. Give us a little laugh. Give us a little.
My chassis.
With the yoke hammered all the way back on, feed the strut tower assembly through the upper controller arm and align it with the two strut mounts at the top of the chassis. If yoke does not align with the 26mm bolt at the bottom of the lower controller arm, you'll need to reattach the yoke at the correct angle. Reattach the anti-sway bar and links using a 22mm open wrench and a 10mm Allen key. Torque to 114 foot-pounds as stated in the Haynes manual. Use a 26mm with an impact wrench and tighten the yoke onto a lower controller arm. Torque to about 81 foot-pounds, as stated in the Haynes manual. This Haynes manual seems to have the answers to life. What is
Before
this, like?
the internet, they kind of were the answer to life when it came to cars.
Place the pinch bolt back into a yoke and tighten from both ends using an 18mm impact wrench. Torque to 52 pounds, as stated in the Haynes manual. You said "at stated" again. Jeez.
Hey, I'm paying you. Rule number 1: never correct your boss.
Tighten the two 18mm nuts on the top strut mounts. Torque to 33 pounds, as stated in the Haynes manual. A strut is when a shock absorber is placed inside of a spring coil assembly. When a shock is not within a spring assembly, it's just referred to as a shock. Remove the cement block from under the lower controller arm ball joint. Place the tire back on. Tighten the lug nuts to 103 foot-pounds of torque. Lower the jack. Apply clear undercoating to prevent the shocks from rusting. We used POR 15 for the undercoating. Can super stiff HD shocks cause your car to go airborne? Yeah. Super stiff HD shocks on a lighter weight vehicle will make the car's dampening of abilities much more rigid. Yes. Someone can be killed from improper use of spring compressors. A compressed spring contains enough energy to go through a human's body if sprung. If you drive on salted roads, More On Reviews recommends coating your shocks. You will need the tools displayed. More On Reviews recommends 3M rubberized coating for bare metals and POR 15 for painted metals. We selected clear POR 15 so the shock's natural paint job would still be visible. Place cardboard underneath the shocks. Apply 2 coats of POR 15 to the shocks with a paintbrush. Let the coating dry in between applications. Be sure that there is no POR15 in the inner ridge of the lid, or else it will be impossible to reopen. The parts and prices are listed below. More reviews saved a total of $724 on this repair. For reviews of the products used in this video, check the links in the description. Thanks for watching.